Australia is known for many things, from jaw-dropping landscapes to scary beasts calling the country its home. But there are other infamous stories from the land down under. Today, I am going to share one of the most infamous unsolved cases of foul crime ever committed in Australia. Before I go any further though, I do feel the need to add a disclaimer. This video covers a case that deals with children and violence against them. This could be potentially triggering to those who are of lighter heart. Please be advised. Now, with all that out of the way, let's meet Australia's infamous Mr. Cruel. We've all heard one version or another of the classic urban legend of the unknown stranger stalking your home. Lurking around your family's home looking for a way in. Looking for a way to terrorize you and your loved ones. Well, for multiple families in Australia, this urban legend became all too agonizingly real. It was a seemingly normal early morning on August 22nd, 1987, when an unidentified man broke into a family home in Lower Plenty, located on the outskirts of Melbourne. This unknown man was readily armed with a knife and a gun. The man proceeded to attack the family. The man demanded the parents roll onto their stomachs, taking away their ability to retaliate against him, tying the parents up by their feet and their hands. At first, the man posed as a thief, simply wanting valuable belongings. The knots the man used are consistent with what sailors would use, potentially revealing this man has nautical experience. The man was already masked, wearing a cliché black ski mask. But he demanded them to go into their wardrobe, but not before blindfolding and gagging each with surgical tape that he had brought with him. He locked both parents in, threatening to kill them if they tried to escape. He made his way to the rest of the house. In the room next door, a 6-year-old boy was sleeping and unaware of the danger coming his way. The boy was luckily mostly unharmed. The man blindfolded and gagged the boy with the same surgical tape and then tied him to his bed, leaving him there as he proceeded to reveal his true intentions. He made his way into the next bedroom, where an 11-year-old girl lay defenseless from this pervert. For over 2 hours, this unknown man assaulted the girl, often taking breaks to explore the house and even making himself food at one point. After the man was done, he left the house with a box of classic records and a blue jacket stolen from the family. This would be the seed of a new urban legend, a legend of a cruel man, a man simply known as Mr. Cruel. After this awful crime, Melbourne police were called in and started investigating the crime. This was not going to be an easy case, however. This attack seemed entirely unprovoked, and the family couldn't think of anybody who would want to harm them. The crime didn't seem to match up with any current open cases at the time either. At the time, Melbourne had a reputation for being a very safe place. The unofficial slogan at the time was even the most livable city in the world. Of course, crime still occurs in the area, but compared to many other cities in the world, it had much lower crime rates. The first thing police did was attempt to pick apart the details of the attack. From the details we know, we can piece together a picture. Everyone but the daughter was bound and gagged and relatively unharmed. The daughter was assaulted over a span of 2 hours, which, over this time, the man also searched the house and stole records in a random coat. This seemingly makes no sense thus far, but more details would arise as the daughter began to share her story. She told investigators that during one of his breaks between assaulting her, he used the family's phone to call someone. This call seemingly sounded like an argument about moving children. He referred to this person as Bozo. The police checked the family's phone records but found no record of this happening at all. Sadly, this was before cell phones really were around. Investigators assumed this was a tactic of Mr. Cruel used to confuse them. Sadly, this case would run cold. Around a year later, tragedy would strike again. The circumstances escalated dramatically with this assault, though. What Mr. Cruel would do next would leave parents and children alike terrified to be alone. On December 27, 1988, just a handful of days after Christmas, John Wills, his wife, and 4 daughters were sleeping in their Ringwood area home, not too far from the first assault's location. John was asleep when sometime around 5:45 a.m., he was awoken by an object being placed on his temple. John heard a whisper, "Don't be a hero," coming from an unknown intruder. This would be the start of a never-ending nightmare for John and his family. The intruder wore a blue ski mask, dark blue overalls, and held a knife and gun in both of his hands. John decided not to fight the intruder, as he may put his family in danger if he did. The man demanded John and his wife roll onto their stomachs and tie them by their hands and feet, just like the first crime. A similar knot was used as well, but to note, it was not the same exact knot. They were blindfolded and gagged, as per usual for Mr. Cruel. He claimed he was only there for money and valuables, but as we've seen before, we know this not to be the case. The man stole a whopping $35 from the bedside table and proceeded to explore the rest of the home. He cut the phone lines and headed straight to the bedroom where the family's 4 daughters were. The man would wake up 10-year-old Sharon Wills by calling her name. He blindfolded her, gagged her, grabbed some of her clothes, and kidnapped her from the house. It took only 15 minutes or so for the parents to break free from their restraints. 15 minutes too late, unfortunately. Their oldest daughter, Sharon, was gone. With phone lines being cut, John ran as fast as he could to the nearest neighbor's house and called the police. He searched the neighborhood up and down trying to find Sharon. Sadly, nothing was found, and it seemed Sharon was truly gone, abducted by the boogeyman, Mr. Cruel. This was only the start of their nightmare, though. For over 18 hours, the Wills family were in a panicked state, worried sick about their 10-year-old daughter who could be potentially in a lot of danger. Then, a light at the end of the tunnel. Sometime after midnight, a woman accidentally found a little girl on a street corner. She was wrapped up in a green garbage bag. It was Sharon Wills. She had been abandoned by her abductor. Surprisingly, even after the nightmare she had been through, Sharon was in strong spirits, calm and collected. The woman that found her called the police, and the Wills family were all reunited. But the investigation into the assault was just beginning. Oddly, it turned up some surprising evidence, or rather, the lack there of any evidence for that matter. Sharon was blindfolded throughout the entire ordeal, so she wasn't able to give a solid physical description of the attacker, but she described him as a soft-spoken, rather upfront individual. He actually seemed to be somewhat caring of his victims, according to Sharon. This, of course, doesn't match up to the egregious crimes that he had just committed. So, investigators made note of it, as it may be of use when profiling this man later. One of the words Sharon used to describe him was gentle, which was also rather shocking to investigators. Further details surrounding Sharon's abduction back up her claims of Mr. Cruel being somewhat caring of his victims. Sharon was apparently fed a Vegemite sandwich and given lemonade. Shortly before being let go, Mr. Cruel had given the 10-year-old a very thorough cleaning, washing off any possible forensic evidence potentially left behind, also clipping her fingernails and toenails, brushing and flossing her teeth, and more. Essentially, destroying any possible chance of being caught. Mr. Cruel either kept Sharon's clothes or destroyed them, as they were never recovered. He dressed her in garbage bags and dropped her off at Baywater High School, just a few miles away from her home. Investigators easily connected this incident to the prior one in Lower Plenty, but they wouldn't make the details of that public for some time. Needless to say, everyone was plagued by fear, and a feeling of hysteria was beginning to take shape. Locals began calling this assailant the HAMPTON Rapist. John Wills took the assault very hard. He had guilt that he could have done more to protect his daughter. He had no way to know any of this would happen, though, and he eventually focused his energy on trying to solve the crime. Unfortunately, the investigation was a dead end and didn't seem to have much of anything. Almost no evidence was left behind or ever found, and none of it could be used to find one specific person. Many in the area began to theorize who this masked boogeyman was, but another more frightening question popped up. Who was next? It would be roughly 2 years before that heart-dropping answer would come. Canterbury, Victoria, lies just on the outskirts of Melbourne. It is not too far from Ringwood and Lower Plenty. It is another suburban area, closer to the center of Melbourne. The Linus family were a well-off English family who rented a house in the esteemed Monomeath Avenue. For those who are unaware, this is a rather high-end area where many Australian politicians and public officials live. The family moved to Australia for business purposes. The family was only living in the area for a temporary time though, preparing to move back to England in the near future. In fact, they had moved to this Melbourne area community specifically to raise their children safely, and were planning on making their move back home just a few days later. It was July 3rd, 1990. It was shortly before midnight when 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola were woken up by an angry masked intruder. He ordered Nicola into the next room to grab her school uniform. She attended the Presbyterian Ladies' College at the time. He tied up Fiona in her bed. The unknown man was armed with a gun and a knife, the trademark of Mr. Cruel. These two lone teenage girls stood no chance of fighting against this man. With the oldest girl bound, the man was able to make his escape without any hassle. What made this attack different is that Mr. Cruel told Fiona that her father would have to pay $25,000 for the return of Nicola. The man then stole the family's rental car and drove off with Nicola. Mr. Cruel drove for about 1 kilometer, and then they parked the car assumably to transfer to another car, effectively leaving investigators stumped. Less than 20 minutes later, Brian and Rosemary Linus would come home and find a nightmare. The police found almost no evidence from the crime scene itself. The intruder's kidnapping of Nicola had been done in a quick, tactical manner. Realizing the tough spot that they were in, with most missing person cases going cold just hours after the initial abduction, this meant they have to work quickly, or things would get very bad very quickly. Unlike the abduction of Sharon Wills, Nicola wasn't returned later that day. Around 36 hours after her abduction, her father Brian held a press conference in which he begged the abductor to return Nicola and stated his willingness to comply with the ransom any way that he could. But Mr. Cruel, living up to his name, demanded a ransom with no way to pay it. Police looked into Brian's work for any potential enemies or foul play going on. The police at the time thought maybe this ransom could be personal in nature. Luckily though, Nicola was found alive somewhere around 50 or so hours after being abducted. It also happened to be her 14th birthday. What a way to celebrate it. Nicola was found at an electricity station in Kew, just a short distance away from her home. Nicola was abandoned by the mysterious man. She was fully dressed at the time and wrapped up in a blanket. She told police her abductor had left her outside the station and told her to sit in a prone position until he drove away. Shortly after that, she removed her blindfold and called her father as soon as she could. Luck would be on investigators' side, as Nicola was able to provide the investigators with some details that were vital to their investigation. The most important detail was the estimation of Mr. Cruel's height. Apparently, he was roughly 5'8". She had guessed this by judging her own height to the attacker when he rushed her from her bedroom to the getaway car, and said that he wasn't much taller than herself. She also shared that the man likely had reddish-brown hair. Nicola also had vital information about the man's house and vehicle, most of which were basic, cliché details. Nicola had been blindfolded for the duration of her captivity, but had been given a few chances to get a glimpse of her surroundings. The man threatened Nicola, saying, "My freedom is worth more than your life," which sounded eerily similar to the threats given to Sharon Wills. a few more important details from Nicola's abduction. Apparently, she heard the man talking to another person. However, she never heard a reply from said person, potentially leading investigators to think an accomplice may have helped. When Nicola was flying back to England with her family, she noted the sound of the plane sounded similar to the sound she heard while at Mr. Cruel's house, meaning he must have been living in the area of the airport at the time. Now, the police had a rough idea of where he lived, how tall he was, and what type of personality he may have had, but it would be too little too late, as the worst had yet to come for Mr. Cruel. John and Phyllis Chan were two hard-working parents that worked roughly 18 hours a day to make sure they could take care of their children. Both were immigrants to Australia. The family owned 3 restaurants in the Eltham area of Victoria, as well as a few realty investments. The two parents didn't usually get home until midnight or later. They would quite often leave their 3 daughters home alone, trusting their 13-year-old daughter Carmen to watch over the younger 2. This would be a mistake, as unknowingly, Mr. Cruel must have been lurking, watching their every move. As detectives believe he would stake out his victims for weeks or even months at a time, learning their habits so he can exploit them to his advantage. It was April 13th, 1991, when terror would strike the Chan family. The family lived in what would be considered a very safe area, but no matter how safe you feel, Mr. Cruel violates all senses of comfort. It was a Saturday, normally a very busy day for the Chan parents, as weekends were the busiest for the family's business. Carmen and her 2 sisters were left alone, which on a Saturday night meant the 3 sisters would be watching movies and TV in Carmen's room together. Sometime around 8:40 p.m., Carmen and one of her sisters went to the family's kitchen to get something to eat. Suddenly, they were confronted by Mr. Cruel, wearing his trademarked ski mask and knife. "I only want your money," Mr. Cruel told the 3 girls, as he had said to his previous victims. He forced the 2 younger daughters into Carmen's closet. He claimed he only wanted Carmen to show him where the money was, and he pushed the bed in front of the closet so they couldn't get out, trapping the 2 girls as he abducted Carmen. It only took a couple of minutes before the girls broke free from their prison. They called their parents right away and alerted the police. By the time police arrived, they knew what had happened without having to investigate too much. Mr. Cruel had struck again. This attack had been planned, and that was evident from what was left in their driveway. Phyllis Chan's Toyota Camry had the words, "Payback, Asian drug dealer, more to come," on it. Police were able to discover Mr. Cruel entered the home through a slit window screen. They tracked his steps through the house, aided by tracking dogs. They tracked him up to 300 meters away before losing his scent in a vacant lot. He must have had his getaway car parked there. Hoping for the safe return of their daughter, the Chan family held a very emotional conference just 72 hours later. Here are a few audio clips from that conference.
Carmen, look, this is your favorite dress. You wear every day. Last Saturday, you left at home. You had to come home and wear it. That coat's waiting for you. You love the coat very much. Carmen, your sister needs you. Don't spoil my family, please. Take my daughter home safe. She loved her sister very much, and her mom and then dad.
As you can hear, the family is absolutely distraught and just want the safe return of their beloved daughter. A few days later, the Chan family sent out an encrypted letter in the local newspaper, using a cipher that Carmen would have been able to decipher. They also offered to pay a ransom for the return of Carmen. Even Carmen's sisters were sending out letters pleading for mercy from Mr. Cruel. Unlike the other cases though, days, weeks, and even months went by with no sign of Carmen or Mr. Cruel. Unfortunately, the first responders to the Chan house botched the scene by not declaring the house as a crime scene, which effectively hindered the potential evidence left behind. There were dozens of police walking throughout the house and looking for leads before investigators could begin to look for clues of their own. Police looked very thoroughly through John Chan's personal and professional life, hoping to find some sort of connection to the message written on his wife's car. The writing on Chan's vehicle was likely nothing more than another bamboozle by Mr. Cruel to throw police off his path. One of the largest manhunts in Australian history, Operation Spectrum, was a multi-million-dollar undertaking that consumed tens of thousands of man-hours, along with many thousands of more volunteer hours, offering a $300,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of Mr. Cruel. The safe return of Carmen Chan was everyone's number one priority. Sadly, almost a year after Carmen's abduction, a man walking his dog around Edgar's Creek in Thomastown stumbled upon something odd. He curiously investigated the scene and was horrified at what he uncovered. The man would rush to contact police, and after an autopsy, it would reveal the fully decomposed skeleton was that of Carmen Chan. She had been shot 3 times in the head. From the looks of it, he killed her execution style. From the decomposition, officials estimated she had been dead for roughly a year, meaning Mr. Cruel was now no longer just a serial kidnapper and rapist, he was now a murderer. Theories have circulated as to why Carmen was killed. Her mother possibly has an explanation though. She claims Carmen was a very stubborn girl who would have fought back and wouldn't have just given up. It's possible she learned who her kidnapper was and paid the ultimate price for it. Over the years, hundreds, if not thousands of rumors about the identity of Mr. Cruel have circulated around the world. It would seem after Carmen, no more future crimes would be pinned to him. He has been potentially connected to several older crimes though, which brings me to my last and final portion of this documentary. I myself have many potential theories as to who this potential psychopath could be. Before I get into my personal theory though, I would like to note a few theories I have seen online that seem the most practical. First, in 2010, Task Force Apollo was launched. With 20 years of technological advancement, officials hoped to bring information to light. Unfortunately, much to the dismay of the task force itself, many of the case files were misfiled, unorganized, or just straight up missing. In fact, one of the vital pieces of evidence that could have led investigators to Mr. Cruel's doorstep, a piece of tape used to bind one of the victims, was missing. Police could have potentially used the piece of tape to recover DNA from Mr. Cruel, but it had disappeared while in police custody. This missing evidence and Mr. Cruel's knowledge and tactical ability made many people think he was potentially a rogue cop, which would make sense seeing as he was always seemingly one step ahead of the police. He knew where and what they would be looking for at all times, it seems. The next theory I found is a bit more interesting. In 2013, just 3 years after Task Force Apollo was launched, Robert Keith Knight was detained. Robert had made a living as a youth worker and school volunteer, but had been arrested on 2 separate occasions for a variety of crimes against children. In 1980 and 1996, Knight had been convicted for several sexual assaults on minors, and a multitude of other victims had come out of the woodwork following his convictions. This would seemingly make him a very interesting potential candidate for Mr. Cruel. The time of Mr. Cruel's assaults would coincide with his post-1980 conviction release as well, which further raises suspicions. Robert would be released from prison in 2009 after his 1996 conviction. He began to collect nude images of children and was once again charged and convicted. He leapt from a second-story prison railing to his death before his trial began. The final theory I found online is the most chilling in my opinion. In 2011, a young girl by the name of Bung Siraboon, who was just 13 years old at the time, went missing in Melbourne. She had only lived in the area for a few years and was finally getting used to her new surroundings. Many locals have whispered that this is the return of Mr. Cruel. If this is in fact the case, the horrifying thought that Mr. Cruel is still out there taking innocent girls off the street is sickening to me. There are no facts tying Mr. Cruel into Bung's disappearance, but it is a very interesting theory nonetheless. To end this video, I would like to now share my personal theory. My theory is a bit weird, but please hear me out before you cast judgment. I don't usually do this in videos, as I feel it may be a bit insensitive to the families and viewers. With that said, I noticed a very interesting theory that not many people have pointed out. The more I looked into it, the more it just kinda made sense to me. When I began searching into the case of Mr. Cruel, I watched quite a few pre-existing documentaries about him online, many of which had very interesting theories, but one particular podcast by YouTube channel Mr. Reality brought this up and I found it very fascinating. So, listen to this. The Golden State Killer was a notorious serial killer also known as the East Area Rapist in the original Night Stalker. Now, I do plan on doing a full documentary on the Golden State Killer, so I won't go too far into that story, but I will show you guys an interesting connection that may blow some minds, whether it's fact or not. In 1986, the notorious Golden State Killer would seemingly vanish after killing at least 13 people, raping upwards of 50, and committing well over 100 burglaries. But did he actually vanish? Or did he simply relocate to a new area? Somewhere far, far away from people who know his crimes. Well, a year after the Golden State Killer would vanish, the first of the Mr. Cruel attacks occurred. These attacks scarily match up with the MO of the Golden State Killer. The first attack matches up to the Golden State Killer to a T. It's honestly so similar, it's giving me goosebumps right now as I talk about it. It is reported that they both took breaks in their attacks to eat food. They both were armed with a knife and a gun. They both talked to people who weren't actually there, and they even used the same expert knots to tie up their victims. The similarities don't end there though. Mr. Cruel and the Golden State Killer wore black ski masks and long hair that would often protrude from the mask. If you look at police sketches, they are almost identical. They would both break into homes and wait to be found by the residents. They were both eerily meticulous in their crimes. And last but not least, they would both be around the same age of 60 to 75 years old, if they were still alive today. The FBI at one point looked into both killers and even contacted the Victoria Police with information about Mr. Cruel and detailed steps on how to catch him and provided crucial information about his personality and why he did what he did. Interestingly enough though, they used the same information on the Golden State Killer's profile as well, which to me seems a little bit more than just a coincidence. Despite what your theory is, Mr. Cruel could potentially still be out there. Just because he has not been heard from or caught does not mean he isn't still victimizing people. There is a new way to be a predator this day and age, an anonymous way. The FBI mentioned Mr. Cruel had strong sexual desires for children and would likely have made his own homemade movies. There are also reports from some of the girls abducted that they thought they could have heard camera noises. Meaning, he probably filmed his attacks on the abducted girls. So, he may not be hunting on the streets. He may be hunting you right at this very moment, online. Thanks for watching this in-depth documentary on the brutal and unsolved story of Mr. Cruel. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it to fresh new eyes. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video. I upload almost every single day. What are your thoughts on this case? Comment them down below and keep this conversation going. Personally, I think the theories I presented today are all viable, whether it be a local, the Golden State Killer, or someone else entirely, I hope justice will be served someday. Thanks again for supporting The Swamp. As always, you can download audio versions of this show on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and every other major podcasting platform. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.